Welcome to In Session Taking Back Control. This podcast contains discussions on topics related to mental health, which may include sensitive and potentially triggering information regarding violence, abuse, addictions, and other mental health conditions. The experiences shared by our guests are personal and represent their individual perspectives. They have voluntarily agreed to share their stories with the aim of fostering understanding and awareness. The content of this podcast is intended for informational and educational purposes only and should not be considered professional advice. It is not a substitute for seeking professional help, diagnosis, or treatment. Always consult a qualified mental health professional for any concerns or questions related to your health and well-being. Listener discretion is advised. If you find any content distressing, we encourage you to pause the episode and seek support from a trusted individual or a mental health professional. Thank you for listening to In Session Taking Back Control, and we hope that the conversations that we share contribute to a deeper understanding of mental health. Hi, Starkeeper. Firstly, thanks for joining me in Session Taking Back Control today. It's great to have you on as a guest. This has been a bit of a process for you and I to get on this podcast because there's been a few technical problems. But just for anybody that doesn't know you, please take a minute to introduce yourself and tell people who you are and what you do.
Thank you so much, Declan. I always love speaking to you, and I believe in getting the timing right. So we're here now. In context of the podcast, I guess the best way to introduce myself is to share I was born in Canada, grew up in Australia, now call Scotland home, and I have 3 daughters. So I'm a mom and a wife, and I'm the CEO of The Haven in Stonehaven, who is committed to wellbeing for social change. That's the short version.
Fantastic. Well, and I think we're going to come to hear a lot about the Haven, hopefully, and the amazing work that you do, because what you're doing up there is phenomenal, and I want to hear a lot more about it, and the journey you've taken to be a third sector CEO or a charity CEO as well, because you and I both know that's no easy feat as well, certainly in this day and age. So it'd be good to hear about some of that stuff from you as well. Just before we do, part of the tradition in this podcast, I feel like, is before we talk about the here and now and the future stuff and all the amazing stuff that you're planning to do, which we kind of preluded before we came on the podcast. I'd like to take you back because you mentioned there, you grew up in Canada, then Australia, and then Scotland. But take me back to wee Starkeeper. What was life like for her? If you can think back, and if she was sitting in front of you, what would it look like? And where did also where did the amazing name come from? Because I love it. So I'm sure you've been asked this before, but for the listeners, tell us a wee bit more.
Oh, goodness. I've been waiting for the day when somebody asks me about how I came across the name Starkeeper. And you're the first one to do it, Declan.
No way.
Yeah, you're the first person to ever ask me, which I
Has
find
everybody
really...
just been so polite?
Yeah.
Am I being cheeky?
No, not at all. I just think that it's sort of the elephant in the room. And that would probably take a long time to explain the Starkeeper journey. But to answer your question in terms of my childhood, I feel really blessed and fortunate because I had a pretty brilliant childhood. And as you get older and you realize that's not everyone's experience, I feel really grateful for that. So I'm from a small town in Nova Scotia called Pugwash, which is a real place. Captain Pugwash was named after it. Population 1,000 people. So it's pretty remarkable that I ended up in Australia, given that both my parents were Canadian and hadn't really traveled anywhere else. Yeah. I was a really spirited child, and it was 7 years before my brother was born. So I sort of had an only child experience in my formative years. And I think I was born a child with an adult trapped inside my body. The only way they could get me to kindergarten was by saying that my cousin, who was the teacher, I had to go along as her helper. So I always saw myself as a big person and just waiting and biding my time until I could be the adult I wanted to be and live the life that really inspired me. I definitely can say with my parents that they never squashed anything out of me, which I think is really important. They just let me be who I was, and whatever I was interested in, they supported me in. And I was extremely close to my grandmother. And I remember, when you look back and you think of your memories in childhood, all my core memories really come from my time with her. And in terms of the length of time I spent with her, it's not proportional to the impact that that had on me, because obviously I grew up away from her on the other side of the world.
Mm-hmm.
But that connection was, distance is just a feeling. It's not a geographical thing for me anyway. And just to tap in a little bit to acknowledge your efforts on your question with my name, I remember I was really sad to be leaving her to move to Australia. And this is probably one of my favorite memories. And she had a beautiful little cottage on the cliff on a beach that I spent a lot of my time at. A really sacred place to me. And she pointed up to the stars and she said to me, anytime we miss each other, we just look at the stars and we know that we'll be looking at the stars at the same time and the stars connect us. So I kind of wonder if maybe that has some kind of connection to it. It took me later on as an adult, when reality kicks in, you realize actually when it's nighttime in Australia, it's daytime in Canada. So there's no way we could have looked at the stars at the same time, but we'll stick with the magical version because it's much more meaningful. But so moving to Australia was the first time I think I guess my brother-in-law calls it like when you wake up, when you realize that the world as you know it is not maybe as you know it. And, I was other. I had an accent. I was different. And that was quite impactful, not necessarily in a negative way, but it definitely gave me resilience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Because, because you can hear a lot of challenge and change, although it was a really nice childhood, like you described, and lots of love and care, lots of change, in a young life. So, at what point, what age did you move to Australia?
Yeah, so I was 7, I believe, 6 or 7. My brother was only 6 months old, and
Right.
especially now, I'm a parent raising my children in a country without any family support in a close sense. It makes me realize just how challenging and difficult that was for my parents, and interesting that I chose that as well as a parent.
Yeah. So what do you connect with in that part of the realization of the challenge? Because you mentioned that you were different. There was the different accent. There would have been probably culturally different as well, maybe, in how you presented with things. And so, was there any particular challenges for 7-year-old Starkeeper who went to Australia and things were very different? In relation to school or development and socializing as well. Was it difficult?
To be honest, in terms of the trajectory of my life, I would say that part was pretty consistent and solid. I think it was later on I more came across the challenges. And in terms of being different, I was still in a predominantly white. I'm not saying like there were other cultures there, but it wasn't something that was presented in my community. So from that perspective of, it was still English speaking, it was still predominantly white, it was still very privileged, it was still very middle class. But even when I moved to the UK later on in my early 20s, I was really shocked that all those things can be consistent, but culturally it's a real wake up call. And in terms of being different, I mean, obviously my name's perhaps an indicator that the way I engage and understand the world with my belief system, I acquired the language and the structure of that later on in my life. But
Mhm.
when I was younger, my mom still talks about it, that there were qualities in me that perhaps indicated I had another way of being in the world. So an example would be like my grade 3 teacher. School was just about to end, and I remember her sitting at her desk, and I just went up to her. Her name was Mrs. Mrs. Perkins. And I said to her, it's going to be okay. Like, I know you're upset, but it will pass. And it turned out she had just taken a phone call and found out that her father had passed away. And she hadn't shown any indication of that. So she thought whether or not she was upset and the other kids didn't notice, or whether I was just attuning into something empathetically. So there's lots of things like that growing up that I would pick up on and attune to, that had a higher level of emotional engagement, awareness, intelligence, whatever word you want to put to it. And so I think as well, from that aspect, it was a little bit challenging. But looking back at it, I didn't feel that.
Well, I suppose that's that part, that it's you, and it sounds like you were really attuned to yourself and not just others, because there is that, when we're talking about attunement, it's about connection. It's about how do we reciprocate that, whether in whatever method that is. So if you were very attuned to yourself, you're going to be more inclined to attune to other people, emotionally, psychologically, and otherwise. But I mean, what an interesting experience for your teacher, though. I mean, what she have thought for this child
Well,
to
I
come up?
think she went to my mom and told my mom what had happened, because it obviously had an impact on her. And because I have no memory of this, I do have memory of going up to her desk, but my mom, obviously shared that with me. And that's why I'm really glad I'm going to learn so much from you on this podcast and your future episodes, Declan, because you probably have like these really cool names like attunement that will explain my personal experiences that perhaps I'm not 100% aware of. But I think the thing that perhaps made me a little bit, my experience in early childhood a little bit different, is because my parents were really supportive. They didn't squash anything out of me. I was naturally quite a confident person. Like, I feel like a lot of time there's this talk about imposter syndrome. And sometimes I feel like I have imposter syndrome about not having imposter syndrome. And that no one really talks about that. I just had this
Yeah,
deep sense of self-belief. It's not that I was trying to be something I wasn't. I was just very clear that, I was allowed to be at the table. Like I said, I was an adult trapped in a kid's body. Like, I sat and ate with the adults. They included me in adult conversations. So I had this deep sense of self-belief. But when it came to like the attunement or the intuitive or the emotional stuff, I also had this inner trust to act on it. And I
yeah.
think that's quite often the bit that is missing.
Mm-hmm.
So there's another experience my mom shares where we were at this fancy yacht club and I was 3 years old and all the boys were chasing all the girls there and none of the adults were intervening. So I could see that these girls were distressed and I could see that the adults weren't taking control of the situation. And so I stand up onto the table on the fancy tablecloth with the sandwiches and my fancy dress and shoes, and basically, scream at the boys to stop chasing the girls as I'm hauling the girls up onto the table with me. So if I saw something
Yeah.
that I didn't feel was right, I felt supported in my own home life that I could act on it. And I think that early learning is something that has served me well, moving on from the here and now in the future.
Yeah. And what you're describing there is something that is, it's very typical of a secure attachment base, where your parents had enabled you and nurtured you to have that care. But also, I mean, we learn, it's a learned behavior. So I imagine that your parents were quite similar in a way. Was there any similarities where you think, right, well, that I learned that from this person or that person in relation to how you connected with others?
Yeah, that's a really interesting observation. I really believe that each generation has a responsibility to step up and take the learning and try and do even better than what they were given. And I think that serves my parents' experiences, although I don't want to talk for them, but, I don't think they were necessarily brought up that way.
Yeah.
And I think they made a concerted effort and decision. And perhaps maybe that's why they moved away as well, to do things differently. And so although it was encouraged in me, I don't think it was something necessarily role modeled in them necessarily. They wanted more for me
Yeah.
and my brother, and latterly on my sister,
Yeah.
and future family generations, which is really noble.
It's a brave step to take. You know, if there's that generational part where, you know, there's a cycle. You know, when we talk about breaking cycles, you know, negative, traumatic cycles, and it sounds like they took that brave step to the point of moving away to kind of remove, because what we know is a lot of the trauma can be environmental as well as, you know, psychological and emotional, and so to remove yourself from an environment that is negative and traumatic and damaging for you, it's a big choice. I mean, not just physically remove yourself, but remove yourself from a whole continent, you know,
Well,
almost
the other side of the world, I
to
mean, this is the 80s, early 80s, right? It's not like
big
how it is
statement.
now.
It's a big statement.
Yeah, and I think it had a real impact on my grandparents,
Yeah.
as well. And I do wonder if the part of the reason why, they moved, and like I said, it's their story. So I want to be mindful of those boundaries and don't want to make assumptions. But later on, when my own mental health kind of journey that I went on, I suspect was perhaps began because of the age I was, perhaps when they started to experience things in their own family and their own lived experience. So it was kind of like this sort of hidden intergenerational trauma
Yeah.
that really only got triggered once I reached a certain age, which was about 15. And then all of a sudden, I think all that got mirrored back, because triggers are only unresolved healing, being poked at. So once I hit my teens, I would say it was a very, very different story and a very different experience. But that's not to take away from this very strong, I think you call it secure attachment, because I had that deep root, it wouldn't become easier, but I would say I always knew I had something to fall back on.
Yeah. And you know, when you're talking and we'll come on to that age 15 stuff, because that's interesting, and I think it's important to talk about that. But when we talk about secure attachment, it's so interesting. I'm just putting these pieces together that you know you're the chief executive of something called the Haven, and that really is symbolic of a secure attachment. You know, in childhood, is that you have a haven in your primary caregivers, that they are your haven, and you trust that no matter what happens, and you go out and you explore the world, and if damage or hurt happens, you still have a safe haven to come back to.
Yeah, that's a really interesting connection. I like that. And I think, though, beyond it being a physical place, which it is in Stonehaven, Aberdeenshire, because I had such a transitory life in terms of not living in one country,
Mhm.
I guess a haven for me is a home, a place you feel safe, you seek sanctuary. But for me, it was your haven's inside of yourself.
Yeah.
It travels with you. So a
Mhm.
real haven means you can put me in any country, in any world, in any culture, and I'm going to seek solace within myself, and I'm going to find that well-being and skills and resilience I need within myself, rather than always externally searching for it elsewhere. It's that, thing where people think if they move away, or if you change relationships, and absolutely that has its role. And
Yeah.
I think having changed scenery at pivotal times was imperative to my mental health journey. But as long as it's not moving into a pattern when you're running away rather than running to.
Yeah. Absolutely. And you're right, you know, the haven is within. And that, that goes back to the stuff that you were taught as a child from age, you know, pre-birth, actually, to the age of, you know, 3 up to 4, and that attachment that your parents gave you, because you can't really change your attachment style. It can fluctuate a wee bit, but, you know, you will always find that, and that's where that secure attachment, that internal haven is found, that you were really gifted
Yes.
as a child, you know, and that sounds like it stood you through a few storms in your life and got you to a point to really be spearheading a real haven.
Yes. And although I appreciate what you're saying, it was my parents, the secure attachment. I think it's really important to also acknowledge the wider family connections, like my grandmother, and I have a really special connection with my aunt and my cousin, the one who I went to kindergarten with, and she pretended I was her assistant.
Yeah.
So, and interestingly, they, just because of the way their life unfolded, didn't have children themselves, but they stepped in and filled this really important mothering qualities, because it's unfair to expect for me to get everything from my parents. You can't
Yeah.
get everything from one person. And I think back, I'm very, very motivated and inspired by ancient cultures. And there's this sort of idea of like these small family units that exist in isolation of each other is really only something that we've started to do in modern times. So understanding the power of these relationships that go beyond just the parents.
Yeah. I absolutely agree with you, Starkeeper, because, like you're saying, even if we historically look at it, and you hear it quite often, it takes a village
Yeah.
to raise someone, and it truly does. It can be like you. I had maternal and paternal grandparents who were instrumental and who I've become today, as well as my parents. So it is about who you're surrounded by and what role they play within that dynamic. And it might be that they hold that nurturing, caring role and maternal role for you, and that's really important, and it's a good acknowledgement. So I'm glad you brought me back to that.
Yeah, no, and also thinking wider, like right now where we live, we don't have any of our sort of blood family here, but there's been really powerful relationships that have impacted my life and my children's life with people who've stepped into that role
Yeah.
as well. And so also just wanting to acknowledge it doesn't have to be, a family that you're biologically related to, that these support systems go beyond as well. I feel kind of blessed because I've kind of got the best of both worlds in that regard.
Yeah, but you're right though. It doesn't have to biologically. You find your tribe, and
Yes.
sometimes you create your tribe, and you will
Yeah.
choose who you surround yourself, who is surrounded by you, and that's really important. That
Yeah.
you know how to do that, and you find those people, and sometimes those people find you when you're not needing it or expecting it, but it's always at the right time usually.
And to take it that one step further, I'd also say your vibe attracts your tribe.
Oh, love it, love it. And I would agree with that as well. I would agree
Yeah.
with that as well.
And
Um,
sometimes you can't pick it either.
no,
It's like because we moved back to Canada briefly when our visa ran out and we didn't have the money to stay in the country, which is interesting because people often don't think of me as being as an immigrant,
yeah,
but that's a whole nother long story. But and when I moved away, the people who and the connections I'd formed with here in Stonehaven, if you had asked me to predict who I would have stayed in contact with and when we moved back, who we picked up with, I would have been completely wrong.
really,
Yeah. So that's
wow,
interesting. People's ability to surprise you. And, I say sometimes people come into your life for a reason and a season, and a few last,
yeah.
a lifetime. So I don't want to diminish the important connections I had at really crucial points, but being able to predict where relationships, how they unfold is something that I found really interesting.
And you're right. It is. It can be periodical when you need them. And it's almost like the universe brings them in for that small period in time when you need them, and then they transition and move on, and that's okay.
Yes.
We don't have to be connected to, and I think that's the misconception with certainly the Western world, that there's that, well, now we're connected, we need to remain connected. It's okay to be disconnected whenever that needs to happen. So, yeah,
I really needed to hear that, Declan. So thank you for saying that. I need to be reminded of that. Because
yeah,
sometimes I feel I've had such powerful experiences with people that I've almost let them down by no longer being connected with them. But that's not the case. And, going back to the tribes, 150 people is what we're biologically wired
Yeah.
to be able to manage. Having 1,000 friends on Facebook, and trying to keep in contact with everyone who's had a powerful impact on your life. We just don't have the capacity for that.
Yeah, no, I mean, we certainly don't. These thousands of people, and it was interesting. Last night, I was actually teaching attachment and relationships on a course, and part of that, as we talk about object relations theory, I don't know if you know about object relations theory,
No,
but
but I'd love to learn more.
but going to take you on a journey of a course here now. So, but part of the theory anyway is that really we're only really capable of deeply, deeply connecting with 5 plus or minus 2 people. So as low as 3, as high as 7. But really, anything more than that, we haven't got the capacity emotionally and psychologically to deeply engage. And that can be anybody or anything, So it can be your partner, it can be your kids, it can be your dog, it can be your hamster, it can be your phone, because everything's relationships. And sadly, at the moment in the world that we live in, everybody has a relationship with their device. So, and I asked that in the group last night. If I was to ask you to live without your phone for the next year, how would it feel? And the answer was, it raised a lot of anxiety, of fear, of, well, I'll be disconnected. Will you be disconnected or will you be reconnected? So, but it's that part, then I asked everybody to think about their 7. They didn't have to, and it's called your significant 7. Not to be confused with the Magnificent Seven, which is a great Western, but not to be confused with that. So it's worth that consideration, and they always change. They can fluctuate. So see, when you're talking about those people who are transitioning in and out of your life, it doesn't mean that they've probably become less important for the stage that you're in your life. So your primary caregiver or person who looks after you growing up, whether it's your grandparent or your parent or whoever that is probably high up there, because they're going to feed you and they're going to give you a roof over your head and all that stuff. You move on in life and you get a partner, and then they take that place, because you're then built to create your own home and family and tribe. So the people who were supposed to do it for that first period in your life have kind of gone down a few pegs, or they might not be in your 7 anymore, because you've got children and dogs, and so it's interesting to think about that. And sometimes, that, do you ever get that? And I've definitely done this, so I don't know if you have Starkeeper, but whenever if you remember back to school and you call your teacher mum or something by accident, and then everybody's like, oh my God, I can't believe we called the teacher mum. But that's because that person is not replacing the mum, but replacing the caregiver role. Well, this person's going to make sure that I get my milk at break time. They're going to make sure I get my lunch. They're going to make sure I put my coat on to go out to the playground if it's raining. They're going to make sure I get home alive. So really, my life depends on this person today. So my primary caregiver might transfer temporarily for that period in time.
I really, really like that theory. But what happens if you have 8 kids?
Well, because it's a theory, what I imagine, right? And I don't have 8 kids, so I can't speak for this, but the theory would say you will have your favorites. You will have a favorite, whether you admit it or not, outwardly to your children, and you have those 8 kids. Somebody's not the favorite. Somebody's like, Jesus, I can't wait till these get out of my house, till I do.
Controversial, Declan. Controversial.
Well, listen, that's what it's all about. It's a theory. It's not my theory. I'm just
Disclaimer.
I'm just sharing a theory. But you will be forced. Your brain will force yourself to say, because funnily last night when we were on the training, somebody said, "Well, can I have 8?" And I said, "Well, no, because it's significant 7. So if it would be significant 8 if that was the case." So what she said, well, I have 3 really good friends, but I can only include 2 if it's 7, because I've got my husband and my kid and da, da, da. And I says, deep, deep down, who would be Like instinctively, who comes to mind of your top two friends that you phone in an emergency? And she was like, well, this person, this person, this. So would they maybe be that significant two that out of the three? Probably, aye, if I was to choose.
And I think that you raise a really valid point in that. And as I went on away from my mostly idyllic childhood into the harsh reality of the world of trauma,
Yeah.
I think when you're in times of crisis, it becomes abundantly clear that you're lucky if you get 7.
Yeah. Yeah.
And once again, having gone through multiple traumas, I would have wrongly predict who it was that had the ability and capacity to show up.
Yeah.
So I think having that emergency contact analogy
Mm-hmm.
is a really good leveler, because everyone wants to show up when things are fun and, let's celebrate the parties.
Yeah.
But who can be there in the hard moments? When you're not your best self, or you're challenging to love, or you're no longer able to have the capacity to give them the things they need from you, do they still show up? And that's definitely been part of my journey. And
Yeah.
I'm fine tuning that inner circle. That's what I call it, the inner circle of
Yeah.
trust,
Like that.
rather than the significant 7, only because I didn't know it, but maybe that will be my new term all the time. It's constant evaluation, because I know with the reality of living in life that I will go through more traumas.
Yeah.
So rather than being reactory to that, how can I cultivate the relationships and nurture the relationships so that when I will inevitably go through another trauma, I don't have the secondary trauma of being let down and abandoned by people who I had wrongly assumed were my significant 7 or inner circle of trust.
Yeah. Or they could be your empowering 8 Starkeeper, whatever way you want to take it, But you're absolutely right, because there is an element to this that we have to think about. We are always thinking about firefighting and protecting ourselves, because it's how we're built as human beings. We're not that clever. We've not evolved enough in thousands of years to actually get to the point that we can survive on our own. We're not built for that. You shared that yourself. Maximum, absolute maximum is 150 as a tribe. And we all have our own role within that tribe. So, but it might not always be everybody in that tribe you can depend on. You described it beautifully there. I described it very brutally last night by saying, I gave the example of my 7, and I was going through it, and then I said, so my last 2 is I've got 2 really good friends that live in Ireland. Don't see them a lot, but I know if I phoned them in the middle of the night and told them I killed somebody, they would come with shovels, right? So that was how I brutally described it. But there's a depth of trust and total congruence in that you can really connect and be your genuine self, rather than the Japanese have this the 3 mask model that they talk about, or 3 mask theory of we all wear 3 masks in life, and our outer mask is the one that we show to people walking down the street, or we show that if we have to go into the shops or whatever, it's social. The next mask is the one that we show our kind of extended family and acquaintances and work and all these types of things, so they know a wee bit more about us. They see underneath the surface level. The next one is probably for our immediate family, the one like our partner, our kids, or whatever. But nobody sees our genuine self, the true, deepest, darkest version of ourselves. That whenever we take all our 3 masks off and we look ourselves in the mirror, and we sometimes brutally scrutinize ourselves for whatever reason, very, very few people will be permitted to see that, because they might hurt us. So why would we allow that level of vulnerability? But some do, and it's getting to that place of who do I show my truest version of myself?
This is meaningful and educational. Thank you, Declan. I love the 3 masks. And culturally, masks are something that you work with in a very obvious way in ancient cultures. And it's something that I've brought into a lot of the work that I do on my workshops and retreats, working with masks. But it's nice to have a little bit of understanding of the theory of it as well. I might nick that one.
You're more than welcome. I mean, I could bore you to tears with theory, but I'm not going to. So, but I'm going to, because you talked a few times there, Starkeeper, about the period in transition in your life when things got a wee bit more difficult, you know, when you were kind of 15, and you mentioned multiple traumas, which I'm not going to ask you what they were unless you're comfortable with it. But I suppose the idea is to think about, how, you know, part of the podcast is how did we turn things around, or what helped us turn things around within those difficult periods in our lives. And I wondered if how you would feel about sharing any of your life experiences in those difficult times.
Yeah. I mean, I'm more than happy to share. I'm just mindful of time and capacity and what would be useful to the greater good. But I mean, from 15, I would say, till I was 30. So we're talking 15 years.
Yeah.
It was a steep learning curve. People use the word dark night of the soul, but it doesn't resonate with me because I think the soul's pure. I think it's about ego, you know, understanding like who you are in relation to the world. And I mean, at 15, my parents, I can't believe it, allowed me to go and live with my grandmother. And I think that was the best thing to do because we all have our strengths. And I think, you know, my earlier childhood was really magical. And then perhaps the sort of secure attachment I needed wasn't maybe there in my teenage years. But that my grandmother, she would say herself, unfortunately, she's passed now, that, you know, she wasn't the best with babies, but she was great with teenagers.
Yeah.
You know, so if you don't have the capacity to hold perhaps things the way you want to, then it's a brave thing to put that trust into someone else. So I'm really grateful for that time I had with her. And I think perhaps all that those elements of myself, which I didn't have the societal context to have the understanding, if I was perhaps more intuitive or more emotionally aware than the average person, I couldn't access that in some way. And I think because of that, it came out in the teens. I was a bit lost and directionless.
Yeah.
I mean, I think rites of passage are really important, going back to the tribal aspects again. And although I sort of lacked that a little bit and was left on my own to find that, and also situational family breakdown kind of scenarios as well. I'm just going to pause there, Declan, because the dog's barking.
That's
Hold
all
on
right.
one sec. Just hold on. You'll have
Yep.
to edit this bit.
That's fine.
Just that way, I'll leave the door open. She can come and go as she pleases.
That's fine. We can edit it and tweak it. That's fine.
Thanks for understanding with that. Yeah, so through familiar breakdowns and just changes, I ended up in a psychiatric hospital in my late teens. I just graduated. Well, actually, no, but in early 20s, sorry. Yeah, late teens, I ended up actually being diagnosed with ADHD, which and put on some medication and started having hallucinations, and it wasn't the right medicine for me. And I don't know if I have ADHD or not to this day, really, because it serves me well and it doesn't stop me being who I want to be and doing what I want to do. So it's not important to me. But that medication, I think, really did a number on me. And then when I ended up in the psychiatric hospital, it was more in my early 20s. I'd finished university. I was about to get married. And I think I just was burnt out and exhausted. And it was really interesting, my time there, because I just needed to get away. I just needed a bit of respite and a break. And there are young women like me in that psychiatric institution who had similar experiences to me in terms of their feeling and how they attune to the world. And that I don't know, but knowing what I know now, perhaps weren't mental health issues. Perhaps it was the lack of understanding around what they were seeing and how they were experiencing the world. So that was really interesting. So I had sort of like emotional and situational depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation. And then in my mid-20s, when I'd had my first baby, I was terrified about postnatal depression because I'd had such severe depression in the past. And ironically, with my first, I didn't have depression. But then with the birth of my second daughter, which was fairly traumatic for my husband, I would say, more than myself, in the sense that I was prepared and kind of knew what was coming just by being intuitive. And I also had deep faith everything would be okay. But I had delayed postnatal syndrome, and I believe now to be PTSD. And that was a very different type of mental health depression journey, because I was feeling nothing. I had no joy. I had no sadness. I felt like a zombie. I didn't know how to fix it. And I just remember the doctor saying, "You're on the highest dose of antidepressants that we can put you on. There's nothing else we can really do." And I was like, how am I going to navigate this? I've got 2 babies in 2 years, a husband who works away. I'm alone here with no support. And they don't put this as one of the solutions for postnatal depression. But surprisingly, I got pregnant again. And I'm so grateful for that pregnancy, because I stopped the antidepressants cold turkey, which was a horrific 3 days, because I was just so scared of being on them and being pregnant. But all those happy hormones, endorphins came in, that hormonal balance. And then I ended up with 3 babies in 3 years, and still a husband that worked away. And I was in a much better place. And then that's when I sort of went on my personal development, spiritual journey, and got a little bit more skills, a little bit more like you with your theories, gives me more understanding. It was kind of like it was stuff that was already happening, but I could put it into a belief system that worked for me. And really, I've never looked back since then, because the strategies have worked for me. But then my daughter went through a trauma sort of when I was in my mid-30s. And that's a very different experience when you have to advocate and basically support somebody who can't meet their basic needs and pull them through it, on the other side. So, and it's very different when it hasn't happened to you. So I think that would be a brief summary, without not going into, extreme detail into each one. But I also had a dear friend who I grew up with, my best friend, who is male, who committed suicide in our early 20s in quite a horrific way. And I seem to have a natural knack, or people with those, specifically young men who have that similar challenges that he had, seem to gravitate towards me. And the holding and the learning of supporting people through that. And also with my line of work, people tend to connect with me quite quickly and open up. And it's a very privileged and honorable place to be, but it can be a heavy thing to carry. But I feel like I'm preaching to the choir about that with your line of work.
Well, firstly, thanks for sharing your journey with your mental health challenges, and I think you mentioned earlier, we will all experience more along our lives, but it sounds like you found that almost your way of managing through that, through and not to be specifically medicated, and but I think you're right. Whenever you take on other people's stuff, it's very heavy, it's very difficult. It's emotionally draining, and there is an element where you then become at sometimes vicariously traumatized if you're constantly being consumed by all these traumatic experiences in people's lives. There was a quote that I love that, when we're talking about vicarious trauma and the experience that you're talking about, where people are attracted to you, it's that magnetism of care that when people are open and honest with you about their difficulties, it's expecting people who are the carer within that relationship to be okay at the end of that is like expecting somebody to walk through water and not get wet.
That's a great analogy.
So it's one I always hold, because I'm always conscious of, at what point am I wading through this, and at what point do I actually need to step out and not be that person just now, and that's okay as well.
Yeah.
So thank you for sharing your experiences. And as you moved on in life, obviously you talked about this briefly earlier on, but you're now the chief executive, and by the way, we'll come back to your book as well, because you've not even mentioned that, but I want to know more
Oh, I
about.
always feel it's a little bit, I don't know, self-serving to mention and
No, but
plug
I
things.
mentioned it for you, so it's not the same, because I'm interested about where it came from, and that,
Mhm.
because everything has a driver, and there's a really deep purpose to your book. So can we touch on your book, and then we'll talk. I want to know more about your role as chief executive at the Haven, and what your amazing plans are for going forward with this fantastic venue.
Yeah, well, a little bit about the book. And I remember when we were at the pub together when I first met
Yeah,
you, and I had shared about the book. I think it must have just come out,
yeah,
and you shared about your book, and we had a nice exchange there. So, with my daughter's trauma in 2017, which coincides with the dream, the idea, the creation of the Haven, and I don't think those two things are coincidence by any means. When I was going through the trauma with her, I just remember this with such exceptional clarity of sitting in front of a laptop and being, I'm going to write down all the things I wish people had told me going through this, because this would have been really helpful to know
yeah.
before I'd gone through this. And at the Haven, we're all about early intervention and prevention,
Good.
because it's the most compassionate, but also the most cost effective response from a societal
Yeah,
point of view. And so and then I just shut the laptop and that was it. And then 5 years later, I was in meditation at the Haven, and I never quite know, and I don't know your audience enough to, I want to keep within the realms of comfortability, but the Haven, the vision symbol is a golden arrow, and it's on the windows. When you come visit, you'll see it. There's sort of like these decals, and the light shone in. So there was this light, an arrow of light on the floor. It was pointing directly at me. And I opened my eyes and I was like, I have to write a book. I have no idea to write a book about. Okay. And then, as you know, because we've had a shared experience with my dreaming state, I had
yeah,
a dream.
yeah.
And in my dream, I opened up my computer and it showed this file and this file, and to open this file. So I
Wow.
woke up in the morning and I opened up my computer and I opened up the files, and there was this document that I'd written 5 years earlier. And it was literally the layout of the book.
Wow.
And I thought, okay, so I wrote the book in 3 months and I had it published within 9 months. And the title's How to Survive When Society Lets You Down. And it's not about the experience of what I supported my daughter through. It's all the learnings and all the teachings. Because there's a line in the book where I say, the stories might be different, but the endings are all the same.
Yeah.
And so it's not going into sort of, the gossipy details, which are great for like shared learning and experience. But sometimes we get so distracted by them that we forget the wisdom and the learning and the gems.
Mm-hmm.
And essentially, it's a map. It's a map to help people navigate what they should do when they feel that they've been let down by societal structures. So
Mm-hmm.
whether that's political, educational, from a medical standpoint. Yes, I think that was your first question. And then I remember what your second question was now.
So definitely the book. So where can you buy your book?
Yes, so it's available on Amazon. If you put in Starkeeper Morton, I believe there's only one.
Of course there is.
Or How to Survive When Society Lets You Down. You can also maybe pop it in the show notes. And also, if there's anyone who really wants a copy of the book and finances are a barrier, I'm more than willing to, if they email me, put my email in, gift book to anyone who really wants it, because that's the whole point of having it, is getting it into the hands of the people who need it, ideally before you need it.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a very kind offer as well, and a very generous offer. Um, which again is testament to who you are. You know, I've not known you very long, but long enough to know that of your genuineness and your kindness, and there's no ulterior motive to any of the things that you do other than passion and kindness. Um,
Thank
which
you.
is it's lovely to experience. It's really nice to experience the work that you do, and to hear about. And by the way, we've not gone on to the name, by the way, so we will come back to that.
Well,
So
we can do that, and then you can decide if you're going to edit it out or
let's
not,
do it.
because
Do it.
it's I would want to do the story justice if I'm going to share it,
Yeah.
and I don't know how long that would take, having never really shared it in a public way before.
Okay.
But yeah, I'm not motivated by money. Money is of no interest to me. I'm motivated by social change and people, fulfilling people's potential and guiding them and helping them get there, because I have this vision, Declan, of like, what if we lived in the world where everyone was their best self, where everyone was the best version that they could possibly be? What would that look like? I mean, I got goosebumps. Like, what would that feel like?
Yeah. Just utopia.
Yeah.
You
And
know?
and I think it's possible. I genuinely do believe that's possible.
Yeah.
So anything I can do, whether that's removing a financial barrier or, just supporting people to whatever they need to get there, what it looks like for them, I'm really passionate about.
Yeah. And you can tell that. You can tell that when you first meet you. That that's the driver. You know, it's no surprise that you're the chief executive of an organization that encompasses all of that. You know, within that feeling. So tell me about I mean, what you do. Well, tell me about the Haven and what it is, and what you do within that.
Hmm. So the Haven, we're just really committed to well-being for social change. So whatever that social change looks like for
Hmm.
people, whether that's from trauma background, a poverty background, inclusion, diversity, and we're a well-being space in Stonehaven, which is just south of Aberdeen for anyone not familiar with it. And we have a well-being space, which is a studio, a mindfulness room, and a healing room. And we also have a teaching garden on the beachfront. And we
Wow.
have community fridges. So there's one in a local charity shop and one in the local academy high school. And our visions for flourishing communities where everyone feels supported, included, and belongs. And we have a community wellbeing project that we're first year in. It's a 3-year project. And we offer free wellbeing activities to the community. It's community led. They decide what they want and we just deliver it. And we just finished our first year. We're supposed to have 2,000 beneficiaries over 3 years, and we've had 1,700 beneficiaries in our first year,
Wow.
and 332 free or donation-based activities available to the community in the first year.
Amazing.
It is. I mean, we're a staff of 2. So we have a lot of help. We have our Haven helpers, our volunteers. We have 40 volunteers. We've got an incredibly wise, deep well of wisdom in our board. And like you said, it takes a village, right?
Yeah.
So as long as you get like-minded, kind-hearted people
Yeah.
together, magical things can happen with very limited resources. And what I'm really excited about, which I have to really say came from you when I first met you,
Okay.
is we are now launching, as of tomorrow, our Haven Wellbeing training, which you inspired.
Amazing. Good for you. Fantastic.
Because in the third sector circles we move in, I remember you saying, look, if any organization's having sustainable issues in terms of not wanting to be grant reliant, you should look at training because it served us really well. And it helps, with your social aims, and you have more impact because it
Yeah,
goes beyond monetary, right?
yeah,
And I remember like I'm so slow to connect the dots though sometimes because I'm like, well, what could we train anyone in? And then I realized, wow, I'm the only kids yoga teacher. I'm the only pregnancy yoga teacher. And I'm so busy with being keeper of the haven. I can't do any more classes, but I can be a senior yoga alliance teacher and
yeah.
create a well-being army. So we're
Stick.
starting off with the kids yoga teacher training, and we have a really exciting program that we're rolling out. And I think what I'm most motivated by is I can train at the haven the way that I wish I had been trained. I don't
Yeah,
know if you had that experience when you were developing your training.
yeah, and but I think that's a really important reflection to take. Is that and for me, when I wrote our training, or we were part of writing our training, was we listened to all the people who had been on placement with us from different providers, and our own personal experiences as therapists across the board. I trained in Ireland. Some people trained different places, and we looked at, right, firstly, what went really well in our courses, but what would we have done differently if we could go back and change it? Because we are now at a really unique point to change the narrative, not change the process, but change how it's delivered in a holistic, empathic, engaging way that doesn't have to come with all the other stuff. And that was again similar to you. That was part of that drive for us. Well, if we could redo this, how could we take the rubber out and start again?
I
So
know I really enjoyed that journey, writing the manual and thinking about what's really important. So, for me, in the well-being space, it's predominantly white, it's predominantly privileged, it's predominantly female. So, if our visions for flourishing communities where everyone feels supported, included, and belongs, what can we do in our training to make it more inclusive in terms of more diversity, in terms of making it more accessible for people who might have financial barriers to accessing training? I was
yeah,
taught nothing about cultural appropriation. So that is really heavily in our training. But also, the amount of people I've seen who do trainings are not mentored and supported to be confident enough to actually do something with it is astounding. So we've brought in quite a hefty part, which also thinks beyond the business side of it. But
yeah.
what does this look from a social enterprise point of view or a well-being economy point of view? And so that I'm very, very, very excited about. And the other aspect is if we can resource up our community, we can improve our community's well-being. So we have 50% subsidized places, and you volunteer at the Haven delivering the training, so gaining confidence and having experience. And then you don't have that much as a financial barrier and outlay.
Oh, I like it.
So I'm really excited about that in particular. I'm hoping, I don't know if I could say it, but there's one organization that works with refugees overseas and
Right.
delivers sports and well-being and yoga. And I'm really hoping that, they'll come on board and then they can receive our training and take this back to their community as well.
What a great idea. I love the whole concept of it, but the creating that army, that's where we need to be. That's because and I know we can't do everything. It starts with that idea and process, but it becomes exhausting and you get burnt out and different things. So how do we create something that will live long after us and enable people to take care of themselves, take care for others, and create a wider well-being community? I love all that.
Absolutely.
I can't wait to see it.
Oh, thank you. And you've been really instrumental and given me so much of your time when I've had lots of questions initially. And I really
Not at
appreciate
all.
that.
No, not at all. It's been a pleasure to be a tiny, minute part of that journey, to hear the idea and just see it flourish. So congratulations, well done.
It might feel tiny to you, but it feels quite momentous to me.
No, nothing. It's Listen. You've done it all. So The odd email or message is nothing, and I'm always here if you need anything else. If I can be of any help at all.
But I also understand what you're saying is that if we can give other people the skills to deliver, then that releases our capacity to continue doing the things that perhaps other people aren't able or willing to do.
Yeah,
And that was really crucial learning in the beginning of the Haven, because that's how it started with, I was volunteering in a maximum security prison. I retrained in kids yoga. Classes grew. I needed a new space and a bigger space. And that's how the Haven started.
yeah,
And the intention was for me just to continue to deliver my yoga classes. But within 3 months, we had like 30 people working on the space, and it became this other being that
yeah,
needed to be held and managed. And I thought, gosh, well, there's loads of incredibly talented people in our community who can deliver well-being,
yeah,
but not necessarily everyone else could take the risks and do the hard kind of questions, and so kind of took on that role and massively upskilled, and I still get to deliver the things that when I can, but I never in a million years could have envisioned being a CEO, and the reality is so much bigger than the dream.
yeah. It's not an easy thing to carry, I think there's a misinterpretation from the title of
Yeah,
CEO, particularly in the comparative to private and third sector, that people will see the title CEO and think that you're rolling in money, and you spend time in the golf course and you do all this kind of stuff, and it can't be further from the truth. Certainly in this sector, where you are everything from the CEO to the cleaner to the light bulb changer to the, there is no power dynamic really in the essence of what you do, because like you get mucked in, and you don't. It's not because you have to. It's because you want to. Because that was the passion that drove you to set all these things up in the first place. That you saw that instrument for change. You were that instrument for change and are that instrument. But I often mentor chief execs in the third sector now, and one of the things that I'll often say, learning from my own experience of what I wish someone told me, was when you get to the point of, you've established the thing, you've ran it once to see if it works, and you get the next part, it's important that you're working on the business and not in it. So I describe it like a chessboard. If you're a chess piece and you're on the board, you can only really see what's in front of you. If you're playing the game, you can strategically place your next three moves. And it's so difficult for third sector chief executives to remain playing the game, because we're so passionate, we want to be in it as well.
that is so wise. There's two really key points you brought up that I would like to just to highlight there. Firstly, the training, the free training that's available in the third sector is incredible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
That we can access. And
yeah,
then the people we meet, like yourself, right? I know we both did the CEO training with the Social Enterprise Academy, which is how
yeah.
we met, because I did
That's
the
right.
cohort online, and then I think you did the cohort just after me. Was yours
Yeah,
online? Or was it
yeah.
on person?
This was online as
It was
well.
online. So we met when they brought us all together in one room, and look what's happened just by us meeting in that one room. I mean, you've inspired a whole training school, and now we're sitting here on your podcast talking about the books we wrote. So I think, sometimes just in the way I'm doing things online, because obviously I have to go down the central belt for all our training and support because there's none
Yeah,
locally. So there's a massive disadvantage there. But people who work in the more commercial sector, they talk about their trainings, and then they hear about the trainings that we've received, and they've spent tens of thousands of pounds, and it's not even close to
yeah,
what we've been given. So I think that's really important to highlight, because I couldn't do it had we not. Well, I couldn't have done it.
yeah.
But yeah, and then the second one, as you said, it's quite a heavy thing to carry. And it's true. And I hadn't expected that. I think I sort of saw people a little bit at the top, or bosses I've had in previous roles. And I'm sort of like, what do they actually do? We always seem to talk to people and flit in and around. And and now being in it, I'm just like, oh my gosh, I just had no idea. I just had no idea. I was teaching a kids yoga class. I'm running a short block just to kind of trial and with the kids wellbeing training we're doing next spring.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the girls, they're 9-10-year-old girls, there's about 8 of them, said to me, "And how are you doing?" And I was so taken aback because I can't actually remember the last time in my organization internally where anyone asked how I was doing.
Yeah.
And I don't say that with any judgment. I'm not disappointed by any means.
Yeah.
It's just the nature of the beast. Now, that's not to say that my husband or my children or my friends don't ask how I am doing, and I didn't know how to respond. Like, how do you respond to a 9-year-old girl who you're teaching about well-being, who cares about how you are, when no one else has asked you that question?
What
And
would it be?
actually, that's what I said to her. That's literally what I said to her. I just said to her my train of thought I shared with you then.
Okay, good.
Thank you so much for asking. Nobody has asked me that question in a really long time because my job is to always ask and help people with where they're at.
Yeah, and there's maybe a deeper message in that, Starkeeper, not just for you and I, but for all the people who are listening to this who are working the care profession, or are the person who always asks the question. Maybe take a minute and ask that other person, who is looking after everyone and doing all the work and in the front line, or supporting people. Ask them if they're okay, because like you, I've been asked very rarely. It's interesting. I actually have one client that asks me on a regular basis, not every week, but every now and again, they'll be like, "How are you today?" And there's almost that, oh, actually somebody gives a shit. you know and I mean it in the nicest way possible. I'm not saying all the people don't care, but because you're in the position you're in, people assume that we just get on with it,
Yeah.
because and they don't see the sleepless nights and the anxiety and the franticness in trying to keep something afloat and alive in times that are really challenging, like cost of living crises and COVID and all these things. That you're right. It's sometimes just nice to be asked.
Yeah, and it's the nature of the role. Like, we are there to serve.
Yeah.
I don't want that to come across that I feel hard done by
No.
people not asking, because that's not the case here. And a very extreme example of this is I remember when we were running a community food larder, we were feeding 1,500 people in our community during the pandemic. I had no background of food security or poverty or anything about food.
Wow.
And my grandmother, who I've referred to a lot in this podcast, she passed away. And my organization was extremely, extremely supportive. And I went during the pandemic when I didn't know if I was going to get in the country, and I'd isolate for 2 weeks by myself. And, they made that happen. And I was able to be there with her when she passed. But when I came back, it just didn't have the same level of depth.
Yeah.
And capacity. I guess that's something else to talk about, is grief as a mental health journey. And, I briefly went on antidepressants, but I was like, there's something wrong if I'm not feeling sad about this.
Yeah.
So I came off them again because I'd sort of forgotten that antidepressants are just, I couldn't feel anything. I couldn't feel joy. I couldn't feel the sadness. And actually I was like, no, I need to feel the sadness as part of my healing journey. But I remember one of the sort of customers came and just started verbal, emotionally diarrheaing all over me.
Yeah.
As they did regularly. And it's really important to me that people feel seen and heard, because reality is most people don't. So as soon as they have the opportunity, they're gonna take it. And I just remember visually putting my hand out and just said like this, like, stop. I don't have the ability to listen to you right now because I'm really struggling myself, but I'm going to find a trained volunteer who can listen to you.
Yeah.
And that was a big thing for me to say. I'd never said that to anybody before, as a beneficiary of our organization. I've never said it to anyone since.
Yeah.
And he didn't even stop to take a breath. He just kept going like a tsunami.
Yeah.
And I realized my emotional well-being does not factor into this at all.
Hmm.
And I just so there's something around being boundaries.
Yeah.
Of understanding that you're there to serve and people see you there to serve them as being a senior leader. And just the nature of the relationship is that it's not meant to go two ways.
Yeah.
And that's okay. And you just need to make sure that you've got strong things in place to make sure you don't end up burnt out, or I always say bitter and resentful. I'm getting out of this before I turn bitter and resentful.
Yeah.
As long as I can remain hopeful, I can continue on.
And it's so true, though. Do you know, if you remember back to when we first met in person in Edinburgh at that meeting, and we were going around the table, and I think the question was, how would you describe being a CEO or something like that, in the third sector? And my recollection of this, and yours might be different, was I would say the majority of the table used words like lonely, isolating, all these types of words where they were kind of just alone, and it was, and it does, it's so, and I think that's where there's an importance and a need, by the way, for us as people who are leading organizations in the third sector to support each other, to connect and stay connected with the point, and not just for like meeting's sake, actually, how are you? Because, is the funding stressing you? And maybe the other person might have some ideas or things that they've seen that might, benefit that other person. How do we work closer together, and stay connected? Back to,
I think that
back to a tribal part.
is so true. It's so true. And I think just listening to you share that remind me of that. It's a little bit like when you become a parent, like everyone can tell you what it's going to be like. And then you cross this threshold and then that's it. You're totally and utterly transformed.
Yeah.
There's no going back and you know the reality of the situation.
Yeah.
And I genuinely don't think that level of depth and understanding can happen in the senior leadership role either, until you've done it. And I would like to make a bit of a differentiation here, which I don't think is really valued and acknowledged in the third sector, and potentially could be a bit contentious.
I'll
But there
say.
is a big difference between being a founder senior leader and a senior leader something you've acquired.
Yeah.
And I actually think the third sector does do this quite well in terms of connections and tribal central belt better than anywhere else. And understandably so population wise. But there are definitely barriers and disadvantages for being remote. But I would like to see more support for founders.
Yeah. I agree. I mean, hands down, and anybody that I've spoken to, exactly what you're saying, because it is that, it's your baby, almost. This has come from a seed, and I don't think anybody, well, nobody, unless it's your partner, who, whenever you looked at the idea and you thought about it, or it came to you in a dream, or whatever that was, it still has to be planned and grown and developed and nurtured, and just like a baby,
Mm-hmm.
you have to take your baby steps, and you have to let it fall, and you have to, allow things that aren't so nice to happen, to learn from them. But nobody knows what it's like to be a parent unless you're a parent. Nobody knows what it's like to be a founder unless you're a founder. It's different, like you say, coming in, if there's an organization already established, then coming in and creating an oversight view of, here's where we are and here's where we want to get to. But when you're bringing it from seed, it's so different, and it's also that part as a founder. At what point am I comfortable to walk away from my child here?
Yeah, that's really interesting. Because I appreciate the baby analogy, and I know that's used quite a lot. It's something I've personally struggled with because I didn't want any more babies. And because I guess I always saw it as a community organization, but
Yeah,
everyone else has this perspective that it's mine because I gave birth to it and created it.
yeah,
So I know it's a bit complex and I think there's a lot to unpack there,
yeah.
but I am at this stage where I've been asking around. I'd be curious to get your feedback on this. And I know we're going away from mental health here a little bit. So if you want
That's
to rein
okay.
me back in,
That's
please do
okay.
so.
Let's go.
Might
Yeah.
need a different CEO third sector leadership podcast.
Podcast. Do you know? I-
Yeah, do it. Do it. Is no one can give me an example, and I have researched of a scenario where a founder has left an organization they have founded well.
Yeah. Um, I don't know of any,
Yeah, I find that fascinating.
and I think the word there as well.
Well,
You know
best
that.
practice,
Yeah,
succession planning, the exit strategy, because the only scenarios I can think of, and please, if anyone's listening and if they find one, will they let us
yeah.
know?
Let us know, please.
Because I have been on a quest and asked numerous people who I believe are in positions that should know,
Yeah,
because it's part of their remit to know these things. Can't find one, which I'm finding mildly disturbing.
yeah,
So they're either burnt out,
yeah,
they've run the organization into the ground, not intentionally. There's no judgment here because you and I well know
oh,
we could have been in that scenario if it tipped in either direction multiple times.
absolutely, absolutely.
There's been some kind of takeover from internally. Can you think of any other scenarios that you know of?
I mean, the only other one I can think of, I mean, you're talking about the transitions and different points, but I think the only other one is to leave an organization while it's still in a good structure, but to move on to another less senior role. So they'll move from being a chief
Yeah.
executive to a senior manager with another
Yes.
organization because they just can't deal with it. But more
Yeah.
often than not, I think the scenario you're talking about is right. It's burnout, burnout or burn down. You know that it's run into the ground, or and like you say, not intentionally. And I
No.
very much am of the viewpoint that I would like to. I don't want to be an old codger founder shuffling about the building, trying to find a job for me to do while I'm eating digestives. You know, that's not for me. So, but I think it's each individual's really unique. But I think the key for you and I and any third sector chief executive, if they're listening to this, is to have an exit strategy that allows you to still fuel your drive and your passion because you're now programmed in a way that you may not have been before, and it will be hard to let that go. So you need to find something that will continue to challenge that without it being to the magnitude in relation to the stress levels that it consumes within the third sector.
Yes, it was the CEO training that, we did with the Social Enterprise
Yeah,
Academy, and they introduced me to the concept of founder syndrome.
yeah,
And I became paranoid, Declan, about founder syndrome.
yeah.
And I actually changed employment contracts around that. So we have sabbaticals and breaks and leadership breaks to
I
test
love
the
that.
robustness of the organization. So I had a 3-month sabbatical. So I wrote the book 2022. I'd finished it by December. I was 3 months on a sabbatical. Didn't touch the book. Just read it again to see if it was something I wanted to put out in the world, really. Got
Yeah.
it published. So that's what I did on my sabbatical. And then at 10 years, I get a 6-month sabbatical.
Wow.
Because, an organization that's totally reliant on one person is not a great strategy for sustainability. It's poorly managed. So an organization should be able to run without you, but run better with you.
Yeah, I like
That's always our aim. And so I'm sort of on that journey right now with the board about what this looks like, what it feels like, because it's it will take, years of planning and strategy
yeah,
to roll out well.
yeah.
But yeah, it'd be nice if we could be maybe buddies on that journey together.
I'm all for a sabbatical. If I'm being offered one, I'm taking it. So
Yeah.
I
That was the
remember
best advice I got from the CEO training.
I remember when you said that to me in the day we met, and it stayed with me. Now, admittedly, I've never taken it any further to look at action in it and requesting it because um, I don't know why. Because actually, that's
Because it's
something I'll have
probably not a
to do.
priority because it's about you.
You're probably right, Starkeeper.
No, I'm right. I'm sorry, Declan. It's all the
That's
stuff we just discussed,
that's
right? It's about
exactly right.
everybody else's well-being because we're
Yeah,
there to serve everybody else's potential and well-being, and ours comes last. But
yeah,
actually, we got it the wrong way around.
yeah.
And the sad thing is about you and I is that we should know better.
I know. Do as I
And
say,
that
not as
doesn't
I do,
mean
though. So
exactly, but we need accountability buddies with that.
yeah, I'm up for that. Let's action that. Let's make that an action point for the end of this podcast. I could talk all day, Starkeeper. I
I
could really
know.
keep
I'm
going.
really sorry. I do have that tendency, and I could just speak to you forever. We never have enough time for each other
Yeah.
because of the nature of our work, but that's no reflection of the deep mutual respect I have for the work you do, but also the way you do it and who you are.
No, I really appreciate that. And likewise, and I'm so keen to get up to the Haven. I'm adamant that I'm going to get up there and see everything that you have to offer. And I want to see the training stuff.
Oh,
So,
yes. I'll have to send you the draft manual. I think you'll
oh,
find it interesting. And I'm regularly down to West Lothian because my peer mentor and social enterprise ally is down at Beach Brae. So I've got no excuse to not come and pop in and
when
see
you're
you.
next here, give me a shout. We'll lock it in. We'll go for a coffee, and we'll put the world to right.
Excellent.
So, but listen, thank you so much for joining me on In Session. Like I say, I genuinely could talk all day, but we have a bit of a closing tradition and reflection at the end of this podcast. Is just to think about, you talked about your journey, I mean, your whole amazing journey, from childhood to chief exec. But if there was anything that helped you in the things that you'd done through those challenging periods to take back control a bit, what was that? What was one of those things and why?
Yeah, I am a really big believer that you need to really listen to all the wisdom that's inside of you, all the healing that's inside of you. And by doing that, you're taking back your power. Because as soon as you start seeking it elsewhere, and I want to be abundantly clear, I am a believer of going and getting medication, seeing a doctor, and getting counseling, 100%.
Yeah,
But you need to start within. And the moment you start taking agency around that,
yeah,
then all of a sudden you are the master of your own destiny. And you're not just expecting other people to come along and do the work or fix it for you.
yeah,
And I understand why that happens because society's conditioned us that way.
yeah,
That you have to go here to get advice or here to get an education or here to receive this qualification. And it's actually, we have it all inside of ourselves. And that sounds quite flippant, but I would also say time. I know you asked for one. I'm going to be greedy and take
that's all
two.
right.
Understanding times. I feel like when you're in crisis in mental health, understandably, you go into survival mode.
Yeah.
And you become very self-centered because you have to be,
Mm-hmm.
because you need to be paying attention to yourself. But actually going back to that tribal thing around community.
Yeah.
So it's the one-to-one with the counselor, it's the one-to-one with the doctor, and then you're sort of left on your own on this sort of journey. It's about bringing it out with time. So when I was really self-centered and I was like, my pain's more than everybody else's, and I'm in crisis, no one else has it as hard as me, and these are the thoughts that go through, is be like, this too shall pass, this too shall pass, this too shall pass, because time goes on regardless. And all you need to do is sometimes just wait it out. Sometimes you float, sometimes it feels like you're drowning a little bit, sometimes it feels like you're swimming. And it's just really keeping the faith in the benevolent universe, knowing that this too shall pass. Because speaking to you about my past and all the things I went through feels like a different person, Declan.
Yeah.
Feels like lifetimes ago.
Yeah.
It's like you've asked me to conjure up 20 past lives.
Yeah.
And I could have ended it at any one of those.
Yeah.
And then I wouldn't have been able to speak to you about, the haven and the book.
Yeah.
And none of that would have unfolded because I believed that my suffering was stuck in this point in time.
Yeah.
So there are my two things, is understanding that you are the sovereign of your own realm.
Yeah.
Taking your power back, taking the control, and then understanding time.
Well, I think that's a great way to end it, and I'm truly thankful that any of those crises in your life didn't end in that time, and you're here to talk about it today, to share your experience and share your passion. So thank you so much for joining me, Starkeeper, on In Session, Taking Back
Thank you
Control.
for feeling that I had something of value to say. That's really special.
You absolutely did. You absolutely did. So thank you so much, and I'm sure we'll speak again.
No doubt. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you for joining us on this episode of In Session, Taking Back Control. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave a review, and share it with anyone who might benefit from our discussions. For more resources and support, please visit us at Better You, and don't forget to tune in for another inspiring conversation. Until next time, take care and take back control.